Well, Grandma and Grandpa, it is so good to have you guys on the podcast joining me. You don't know how long I've wanted to do this.
No, we can't imagine.
Oh, man. Well, our producer came to me and said, hey, I want to do a Widowhood series. And I said, man, I want to have my grandparents on here because there's so many different reasons. One, obviously, we'll get into your story, and you guys have both experienced widowhood in that season. You've each lost a spouse. But two, you guys have been all through my entire life, and were in a very critical moment and season for me. You guys were encouragement to me at the deepest level, and I'll never forget you guys, as well as the rest of the family, showing up at the hospital on November 10th when Amanda was there, and we're waiting for test results to come back, and we're all just sitting there at her hospital, the foot of her hospital bed. And I mean, never forget just worshiping together, singing, praying. And I'll never forget the moment of looking around and seeing everybody in our family and knowing some of each of their stories and the losses that had been experienced in our family, but particularly looking at you guys and thinking, if I lose Amanda right now, I know that because Grandma and Grandpa have walked through this, I know I can get through this. And those are these tangible moments where you borrow people's faith. And I think that, to me, it spoke so much about legacy. It spoke so much to me about that, for me, what I'm grateful for in my particular story that not a lot of people have in their story is this bedrock, this foundation that goes years beyond yourself, that has kind of been built. And, there's layers upon layers upon layers of speaking to and experiencing God's faithfulness, that now I'm kind of reaping some of those rewards in some way. If you want to say it like that, I'm reaping the benefits of this legacy that has been passed down. And so that's why this conversation is so meaningful to me. And I just wanted the entire world, as much as we could get in, to listen to just us have a conversation about God's faithfulness. And so thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Grandma, you said something about that moment in the hospital with Amanda. You said that when Jim walked into the room. Tell me what you said about that, because that was really cool.
Our pastor was there that day, and he said he sensed a lot of the things that were going on, but he said when Jim Blackburn walked into the room, a confidence and a calm came with him. And for him, it was almost as though it were tangible.
Yeah.
And he said, I observed something I'd never seen before.
Wow. What was that? Because that's not something you can manufacture. I mean, I think everybody would say, oh, I would love to live the kind of life that when I walk into a room, that's the kind of presence that I carry, but that's not something you can just put on, Well,
I think it was God at that point, first of all, giving me an ability to communicate to you, but I think it was God working in your favor at that point, because that was such a moment of incomprehensible fear and doubt and whatever else goes with that kind of situation in our lives. And I just think God took care of the whole thing. He was there, and he was taking care of Davey and the family, because we were all just devastated by what was going on.
Yeah.
So it wasn't I can assure you of that. Because I had when I got the phone call from your dad that morning, must have been 7:30 in the morning, he said, Dad, could you please get in touch with Davey, get to the hospital as soon as you can. Something has happened to Amanda. And I was just, blown away. I just quickly jumped in the car and headed out. I called you, I think, on the way, and you were on the way to the hospital at that point, not knowing at all what had happened. Even you didn't know the full story. But then we got to the hospital, and it just seemed like God's presence was there, just hovering over us, and we didn't know what next steps to take, or what next to even say, but God was there.
Christy and I have been, especially with the trial and stuff, that at this point, when people are listening to this, it probably has happened already. But we've been listening to and watching a bunch of videos, one of Amanda, and just kind of remembering her, but also of that day. I have a video that the camera of the phone is pointed just to a hospital bed. You can tell it's like all up close, and it's like sheets of a hospital bed. So you don't see anything that's going on, but what you can hear is our entire family going from hymn to hymn to hymn and singing. And of course you can hear, in between all of that, the crying and the weeping and the sniffling and the groans and the pain. And, but you can't quite describe what you're listening to other than it's like heaven touched earth.
It didn't just affect those of us in the room, though.
Yeah.
I mean, the total hospital staff,
yeah,
they were out in the hall holding hands, most of them crying.
Yeah.
They joined in the singing if they knew the song. It was an amazing time together as God ministered, as only He can do. He ministered to all of our hearts.
Yeah. Yeah.
I remember when I got to the hospital, because we had been away, just got home the night before, and I said to Jim, I've got to jump in the shower before, and I'll come. I remember when I got there and we found out she had been shot, and nobody was talking about surgery. I realized, I don't think any of us ever talked to each other about it, but I realized this is probably going to be it. And yet there were others who were more medical than I who were there.
Yeah.
And yet the focus was on God's presence, God's comfort. And even though we all had a lot of uncertainty, it was, I don't know what tomorrow will be, but He will be there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the other thing that I was thinking about when we were standing there is just how many of our family were there. And then you think about each one of their stories, and you think about the faithfulness of God in each one of their lives. And, the only reason I know that is just because the family stays in touch and stays intact to the best that it can with, as much as life and callings and stuff disperse us around the world. But I also remember vividly over the years growing up and going around the circle of families during Thanksgiving or Christmas and just sharing, hey, here's kind of an update on what's gone on in our family this year. And here's how the Lord has been faithful in our family's life this year. And inevitably, there's going to be tears that are, ensuing throughout the whole thing. At some point, there's like a breaking point in the whole conversation. And everybody starts crying and praying for each other. And those are very vivid, tangible memories I have of growing up that I couldn't articulate back then. I didn't know what that was. And in some ways, I thought it was kind of what every family does. But the more I've lived life and the more we've served and helped people in ministry, the more you realize that's very rare. Very rare to have a family construct that, again, is not perfect by any means. But when you look at, the kids that are represented from your legacy with Uncle Ken and Aunt Serena, with, Darren and Darla, with Steve and Diane, with my parents, you've got these just rock solid folks who love the Lord, who many are serving in ministry. If they're not serving, they're serving in the marketplace, but they're in ministry. It's crazy. And I think about that and I go, how does that happen? I don't have an answer for that. I'm hoping you guys have an answer. Like, how does that happen?
Well, with me, it started way back in a little small country church in Tennessee, where I truly found the Lord with a pastor who was concerned about everything in our lives, and a mom and dad who loved the Lord above all else. They didn't have a lot. We had very little in our lives, but we had the Lord, and we learned that every moment of every day, God was with us. And it just, you grow from that, and life experiences and everything. I don't know that I intentionally planned a legacy.
Yeah, right.
You just live your life.
Yeah.
And as God opens doors and windows of ministry in your life, you try to walk through them. But God had a plan. It's that wonderful plan for all of our lives that is just, it's unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah. Now, Grandpa, you grew up, and correct me if I'm wrong, but your dad was some kind of a pastor, right? A preacher? No. Your grandfather was, right?
No.
Okay. Talk to me about your kind of legacy.
I'm the first preacher in the family.
Okay, first preacher in the family. All right.
My father was
I'm thinking of the Norman
actually.
side. That's what I'm thinking of, is the Norman side.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
He was a millwright.
All right.
With the Tennessee Valley Authority.
Okay.
In Tennessee. My mom was, if anybody, she was the church person in the family because, she was director of the Women's Missionary Society, the youth program. She gave all the children's sermons, and it was just pretty amazing because it was a very small church. I think the maximum we ever had in that church was 75 people. But we had a great group of young people, and as I mentioned, a pastor who really cared. I don't think there was a Sunday that went by that Brother Smith didn't just stop for a moment and say, "Jim, how are things between you and the Lord right now?" Boy, he kept me on my toes. Wednesday night prayer meeting, if you didn't give a testimony, he wanted to know why.
What's funny is I had a guy that I played baseball with growing up, and his dad was the coach at a local college that I really wanted to go to, eventually when I went to college. But he would stand on the other side of the fence, and I'm on the on-deck circle, getting ready to go bat. And every time he saw me, he'd just right through the fence, "How are you, Davey?" And then he'd say, "How are you in the Lord?" And there are some seasons of life where I'm like, I don't want to answer this question right now, but it was like, it was like a kind of a guardrail there for me that continued to remind me, oh, like that's something I need to attend to, That's so funny that you had the same experience.
Yeah, it was the same.
So how did you meet Grandma Della?
Well, we met at college, actually at it's now Southern Wesleyan. It was Central Wesleyan College in those days. And we had common interest, and we sang in the choir together and that kind of thing. But we didn't actually get together until late in the sophomore year. The college at that point only had associate degrees, except for ministry, and that they had a bachelor's degree in ministry.
Okay.
But we were just getting ready for graduation. But one of the things that we did, the sophomore class always prepared a play for, the school. And we were in the play together and kind of got acquainted, and that's how it all started. We graduated, and she went into nursing then at a hospital in Ohio, and I transferred to Marion College where I finished up my degree.
Yeah.
But we continued our relationship.
Yeah. So right after, how long was it after that you guys decided to go to the mission field?
Well, during our courtship, we talked about it because I had a call to missions when I was only 12.
Okay.
And I intended to go to a mission field somewhere. But, and she was in favor of it. She wanted to do whatever the Lord wanted us to do. And I think she kind of had the attitude, well, if we get married and if you're called to the mission field, if you go to the mission field, I'll go with you. We'll work together. And that's why she went into nursing. She was very much interested in being a missionary nurse.
Yeah.
And but she never really had a call until one day our oldest daughter, Diane, was approaching her first birthday, and we were visiting with family down in North Carolina. And Della and her sister were taking Diane for a walk, and they were doing some shopping, and here was a situation where they had to walk down about 20 cement steps to get to the shopping area.
Yeah.
And so she decided to just take the stroller, and just go down the steps a step at a time. But somehow the handle had not gotten really well installed in the stroller. And it took that first step, and that handle broke loose, and baby and stroller and all went head over heels down those concrete steps. It was just, she said it was the most terrifying moment of her life. And she yelled, "My baby, my baby." And some lady at the bottom of the steps turned around and literally caught Diane in her arms.
Wow.
They laid her out on a bedspread there and called the emergency, but no problem. It's had a little tiny bruise on her face that showed up in her one-year pictures, of course.
Yeah.
But it was at that moment that God spoke to Della.
Mm.
And he said to her very plainly, he said, "You don't know what's going on the mission field." Mm. But she was always worried about, snakes and all these missionary stories that were told. But he said, "Wherever you are, you need me to take care of you and your family. And I'll always take care of Diane."
Wow.
So that was when she felt definitely in her heart that missions was where she wanted to be.
Wow. Wow. Well, you guys received a calling or chose, however it panned out. I'm not sure if God told you exactly that Haiti is where you need to go, or if it was one of those like throw a dart on a map, but you chose a very difficult place to go and do missions.
But it was a wonderful place. It was a great place of ministry, a great place for the kids to grow up. We loved those years in Haiti.
Yeah. What were you doing there? What was Grandma Della doing there on the mission field?
She was a nurse.
Okay.
And so she worked in the clinic at Port Margot in northern Haiti, and then in the hospital over on Lago Nave, where the main hospital was located. But she was almost like a nurse practitioner at least, and even for a year was the only medical person available at the hospital in Lago Nave. It was a time when it was just very, very difficult. But it was through that ministry that she was able to minister to the people. I was just a general missionary. I was in charge of one of the stations, and went out every weekend. Practically every weekend I was out somewhere preaching in one of the churches and holding business meetings and trying to help the pastors in anything that they could do. Building churches, doing plumbing, changing tires on the car as we went back and forth on those rough roads.
I bet, I was going to say you probably had to change a lot of tires on those roads.
Yeah, I did.
Wow.
So it was just, you learn, and there is no fixed job description for a missionary. You just do what has to be done, when it has to be done, and trust the Lord to help you.
Wow. Which, in some cases it should describe every position in ministry, right?
That's
it's
true.
Like we do what has to be done to help people when it needs to be done, and we trust the Lord with the results, What a refreshing, simple take on ministry, So you guys were there on the mission field for how long?
We were there for 8 years.
8 years.
Actually, 1 year home for furlough, but from 1962 to 70,
Okay.
we were in Haiti.
And then you came back, and you lived where?
I went, actually, I was accepted into a graduate program at Miami University in Ohio. And I was there about 4 years, from 70 to 74. I finished all of my classwork. And then the last 2 years I was there, I worked in the registrar's office as assistant registrar.
Okay. And then when was it that you guys moved over to Marion then?
In 74, I got a phone call from a great friend of mine that was working at Marion College. And he said, can I stop and see you all sometime? I said, sure, when you're in town, just give us a call. We'd love to see you. So my friend Billy Kahneman came to see us. And that's when he opened a door that we had no idea. I mean, it was no thought whatsoever in our minds. But he said to Della, the nursing program had just begun at Marion College. And he said, we have to have someone who can develop a mental health nursing program for us.
Wow.
And she was in the process of finishing her degree at Miami in psychology.
Okay.
And so it was a perfect fit for her.
Yeah.
And he said to me, well, we need an admissions director and a registrar at Marion College too, and so we'd like you all to come and interview for those jobs. So we did, and on our way back from Marion, we thought, this is such a big move for us. I've never been a registrar.
Yeah.
She'd never, actually been that involved in teaching in nursing, at least. So we sat down, like you say, we took a sheet of paper, drew a line down the middle, the pros and the cons, and there were all kinds of pros that occurred to us, but we couldn't think of a good reason why we should not do it. And God just began to open doors, and it worked out beautifully.
Yeah.
I had no idea I was going to. When I first came to Miami, I didn't have a penny in my pocket to pay for a graduate program, but I got miraculously a graduate position with the registrar's office, and then wouldn't you believe that was the job that opened up at Marion College?
Wow.
So I got my practical experience there at Miami.
Yeah.
And, God, he just has a way of working out the plan in our lives if we open our hearts to him.
Yeah. One of the things that I love in hearing, this has always been the case for you, Grandpa, the way you just said that, God always has a way of working out the plan in our lives. I feel like I heard that some shape or form of that phrase from you so many times growing up, so many times in my adulthood, and in that tone that feels very much like, what are we worried about? What are we worried about? And I think that's such an important reminder to all of us, because how many times can we get so caught up and concerned and worried for what's going to happen today, or even worried about if I don't make this decision properly, if I don't do the exact right thing, then somehow I'm going to unravel God's plan in my life. And yet it seems like the posture that Jesus calls us to take, right, in Matthew chapter 6 is, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Let me work.
Yeah.
And then, you go to Marion. That happens to be the place that my dad ends up meeting my mom,
right?
And they, of course, they date, some in high school and then through college. They get married in college. And, there's these providential things that you see that, hearing some of the backstory, it's really cool to look back and go, this is what led to this, what led to this, what led to this. And so there's some kind of a pivotal moment or decision or breakthrough that's happening for whoever's listening to this right now that you have no idea how it's going to turn out. And it might cause you some fear and trepidation right now. But, hear from my grandpa, hey, God has a way of working these things out,
It's easier to see as you look back, however.
Yeah.
At this point in my life, as I look back, God has never once failed. And so, I know that's true. So why shouldn't I face tomorrow with that same kind of faith? It's not always that easy.
Yeah.
But God is so faithful.
Wow. Okay. Let's kind of shift gears a little bit. We're going to pause your part of the story right there, Grandpa, and let's talk to Grandma. And I'd love to hear some of how, your upbringing and how you and Bob met.
Well, I am from a pastor's home. My father was a pastor most of my life. However, before he entered ministry with 5 children and married, and he was, I guess, what would be comparable today to a superintendent of an ironworks in Parkersburg, West Virginia. We always found it interesting that when he answered God's call, and still working there, he had a Bible study among his co-workers before he left, and many of those men also entered ministry from that. And then he began to pastor, and this was all before I was born, but it was 3 or 4 pastors down the road before he ever made comparable to what he had left. And that was during, I think, the Depression. But I'm the 8th of 9 children. And we never doubted that our folks cared for us, but on a minister's salary, and 4 of my brothers and sisters were in college before I remember a lot about them being home. But we did know that they loved us and they loved the Lord. And as I look back, I realize those are 2 super pluses.
Yeah.
We always had a family altar, and I thought, like you, that everybody had that kind of a home.
Right.
I had no idea, except that I knew that our friends would kind of work at a time when they would be at our house during this time. It was not a long, drawn-out thing, but we would have prayer when we started the day. We'd had all the usual problems that I think every family of that size would have.
Which is probably not problems that many of us are aware of because we don't have families that size.
That's right. That's exactly right. However, all of us worked from the time we were quite young. We all helped, and we went to college on scholarships and jobs and whatever we needed to do in order to get what we felt like was important to help us to make it in life. When I graduated from college, I went to a state university. I went to Indiana to teach. And I was teaching in a Christian high school there, but it also had a college campus.
Okay.
And my to-be husband came as a student to the college. Now, he had worked in a factory. He had been a welder, and he had all of the horses, the sports car, you name it, motorcycle. And when God began to speak to him, he was offered a full ride scholarship to go to engineering school by the company he was working for. But he said in his heart, he had already told the Lord he would go to prepare for ministry. So he went in and told them, I'm sorry, I cannot accept this. I appreciate the offer, but I'm headed to college to prepare for ministry. And so when he came to college, he was older than most of the students that he started with. He worked as a welder at the college. They were building some buildings, and since he was a coded, certified welder, he trained horses. Many of the things that he had done in his before life, he did that. And then after college, we moved, and he went through seminary. And it was at the end of seminary when we accepted the first pastorate to a church in Appleton, Wisconsin. Now, we had always thought we would return to the area where he had roots and had grown up, but that was not God's plan. And as we look back, we see God's plan. We moved to an area where the gentleman that became his doctor that saved his life lived about 3 doors from us.
Wow.
We went to a church, although small in number, the whole community. Within just a few months after our move, my husband had a strep throat. We did not realize that a strep throat was dangerous. That was in the fall, and by December, he had end-stage kidney failure from the strep throat. And that began a journey of 20 years of dealing with a multitude of medical problems.
Wow.
We were at a church in a community that loved us. We exhausted our major insurance, health insurance, within the first 3 months.
Wow.
That he was, and even back in the early 70s, through that period, his medical expenses were $1.5 million.
Oh my goodness! Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
6 months in critical care, numerous surgeries, and in the midst of this, after we had been to this church for 4 years, the largest church in our district called him to be their pastor, and I thought they were crazy. Here they are calling this man that spends 3 days a week in the hospital on dialysis. And they said, no, we feel like if you're God's man for us, then you come and we'll work it out. And we did, and the chief of staff at the hospital was a member of the church and paved the way. And kind of like your grandpa said, you know, God answered our prayers and led us all of the way.
Wow. Wow.
And then for that, in the midst of all of that, we were there for a number of years, probably 13 years. And our son was graduating from college, and my husband said to me one day, I think I have 5 years to live, and I will either be totally capacitated or I will be gone.
Wow.
And I think that I need to be at a place where I can influence the next generation, and I should, and that you need to go back to graduate school and get ready to support if something happened to him. And our son was starting college.
Yeah.
And we didn't have 5 years. We only had 2.
Wow.
And it was when my husband first became ill, he prayed and asked the Lord to please let him live long enough for him to get our son through
college.
the teenage years.
Oh, through the teenage. Wow.
And so God did that.
Wow.
Some of our relatives said they wish he hadn't been quite so specific about what he asked, because my husband's father had died when he was 10. So he knew the loss that was, and so he had asked God for that. But after having been in the hospital, had 2 transplants, a liver transplant, 26 surgeries. On Christmas Day, God took him to heaven. And I remember people saying, what a terrible day for him to die. And our son said, I can't think of a better day.
Wow.
Because he said his dad believed in Christmas. He preached about it. He loved it. And he said, we sent the best gift we have.
Wow.
And that turned all of our attitude and attention to the Lord.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of life is what you choose to do with it.
Right.
And my prayer earnestly at that time was, Lord, don't let me be bitter. I had seen so many people who are bitter about what happened in their life, and I realized it runs their lives.
Yeah.
And I was particularly concerned, if I become bitter, what about our family? And
Wow.
so I committed to rejoice and thank the Lord for the good things rather than to dwell on the difficulties.
Wow. You know, we talk often about the fact that there seems to be kind of two different types of people when tragedy happens. There are those who take the position, the posture of what you spoke to a second ago that said, what a terrible day. That's the worst day that could have happened. And then you have the other side of things that choose to take the posture that you guys chose, that Uncle Ken expressed, that chose to look at it from a different lens. And I think that's so interesting because, I mean, that right there, the discrepancy between those two viewpoints and perspectives really begins to lay out a trajectory for how you're going to walk through pain and suffering and loss and grief and hardship. Not to say you can't change and, like repent or take on a different perspective or the Lord do some kind of transformative work, but it's interesting that some choose to go here and some choose to go here.
Yes.
And yet at the same time, something we were talking about before we jumped on these microphones and kind of went on air was how important it is to acknowledge your humanity in those moments, and that those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can trust in the Lord and yet still feel despair.
Yes.
Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
I think so. And, with my position in my family, I have many siblings that are a lot older than I am. And I remember that my oldest sister's husband, my sister, had died. And he was talking to me one day and he said to me, Martha, give yourself the freedom to feel however you're going to feel. And he said, you don't have to hold up for God. He can handle it.
Yeah.
And he said, when you're having a tough day, say, this is a tough day, but I know that God is with me and it'll be better.
Yeah.
And I think that was extremely helpful in healing, and it was freeing. Sometimes, you meet people that they're so fake. It's kind of like, I'm so happy holding hands with Jesus. Well, I'm glad you do. But what I think is sometimes I look at people and say, let's get real. God is God, and he loves us. I just tell you, when Jim was diagnosed with cancer, and he the prognosis was, will he live or will he not? Now, you have to understand, your grandpa, he's pretty calm, and he said to me, now, Martha, it'll be all right if I live or if I don't. And I looked at him and I said, well, I know in light of eternity, it'll be all right. But is it okay with you if it's not all right with me today? And I don't think that takes anything away from our confidence with the Lord, but he is with us in however we are.
Right.
And he's the calm, collected one. And I'm the one that's always thinking of, let's get this organized. Let's get this planned. Let's get this laid out. And God doesn't always go with my plan.
Right. Yeah. Conventionally, he doesn't. Ever. It seems like go with our plans. We wish that he would sometimes. On occasion, God, can you just go with what I have planned?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
But his plan is better.
Way better.
And even in the unanswered questions of life, I have enough confidence in the Lord that he knows.
Yeah.
A long time I used to say, well, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask God this, or this.
Yeah.
But the older I get and the more I walk with him, I don't think it's going to make any difference.
Yep. I kind of think sometimes that it's more or less that we're not necessarily going to desire to get answers from Jesus, it's like we're going to look at him and it's all going to make sense.
Yes.
It's just like with one glance at our Savior, we're going to go, oh, okay. You know?
Yeah.
One thing that struck me as you were talking, Grandma, is that, you know, Ken was in college, and I know Ken really well. Ken's on our board with Nothing Is Wasted. So those of you guys who are listening, he's, you know, very involved in the work of our ministry as well as just in our life. We love Ken and Serena and respect him. He's a pastor in Columbus, Ohio, and they, you know, operate the Pain to Purpose course, partnering with our ministry and stuff. And so Ken's an unbelievable man of God. Very easily, he could have grown bitter as well. I mean, he spent most of his upbringing watching his dad suffer.
Always. He was 18 months old when his father became ill.
Yeah. So can you look back on anything and see anything that maybe you guys tried to do intentionally, or that, you know, do you just chalk it up to like that was his reality and that's just kind of what he experienced? Or was there anything that, you know, you guys had to almost intentionally say, how do we keep pointing him back to the faithfulness of God even in the midst of all of this?
Well, it's interesting because when Ken was probably early 20s, he and I were having a conversation, and he said to me, Mom, are you trying to tell me that my life was never normal? And I said, well, I guess that's what I am trying to tell you. And he said, well, you know, I wasn't so aware of that. I just thought every family probably had an ill member. And it became, certainly, you know, he spent hospital, like Christmases in the hospital. His father was transplanted successfully over Christmas time when Ken was a first grader. And we just made Christmas in the hospital out of a canteen machine. And because we didn't try to make that as an excuse of, you know, his participation in life, his participation in school, his participation in church. He said, well, I just thought it was pretty normal. And we always seemed to have a house full. Although we only had one child, our house was pretty open, and lots of, whatever the age our son was, there were always plenty of kids around, and as well as other adults. And he said he wasn't aware that it wasn't normal because for him it was normal.
Wow.
And I think that's the Lord helping us.
Yeah.
And obviously we had a lot of people coming and helping us, you know. He had to go twice. He went away and stayed with my sister during some critical, horrible times. But they did a great job of loving him and surrounding him as a family.
Wow. What year was it that Bob passed?
1990, Christmas Day.
Christmas Day, 1990. Wow. You know, Grandpa, you alluded to earlier that it's a lot easier to see God's faithfulness when you look back. When you're in the midst of it, it doesn't feel like it's, you know, God's being faithful. And, you know, with Grandma Della, you guys experienced a season that I'm sure felt like it was in the midst of that deep, dark valley where you were having trouble seeing God's faithfulness. Can you talk about that?
Well, actually, we were on the mountain before. We were just, you know, our kids were all married. In fact, just as we were leaving, Marion, our youngest, Darla, got married. But your dad, David, and Brenda were married, Diane and Steve. So all three of our kids went to college. They found their mates. They knew the Lord, were walking with the Lord, and were following God's plan for their life, which made it great. I mean, we were walking on the mountaintop.
Yeah.
I loved my work at Marion College. I thought, man, this is where I will be for the rest of my life. But it didn't work out that way because I was, for 10 years, the registrar, and then for the last 3 years, I headed up the fundraising effort at the college. And during that period, there was a change in administration at the college. And so my description of it is there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. And so I was out. But Della was still head of the nursing department, so it really created a real difficult time for us at that point. I tried to get a job in the area, but nothing seemed to open up. And she received an announcement somewhere in a professional magazine, a Christian magazine that she was reading, that they needed a dean of the School of Nursing at Azusa Pacific out in California. So she, wrote a note to them and said she might be interested. And so they brought us both out, and she interviewed for 2 or 3 days with, all the college people, and they all fell in love with her. They said, "You're the one that God has called for this job. We need you now." So we started making plans. She signed a contract. I think it must have been sometime in maybe late July of '87. And we were excited, kind of devastated to be leaving family, but excited about the possibilities.
New adventure, yeah.
And so she accepted the job. I found us an apartment out there. We made arrangements to move. Everything was moving along. But the first week of August, she began to develop some serious pain in her abdomen. I had no idea what it was. And I took her immediately to the doctor, and they discovered that she had ovarian cancer. And he sent her to Indianapolis for surgery, and they did the surgery and weren't able to get it all, but they thought, with chemo and all, they might be able to extend her life for a few years. Well, here she had a contract at Azusa, and all of a sudden, within 10 days after she sent the contract in, they discover she has cancer. So what do we do about that?
Wow, yeah.
So we contacted the officials at Azusa, and they said to us, this is crazy, but we insist that you come on, honor this contract. We need you. And only 10 miles from where you're going to be living is one of the finest cancer care centers in the world, the City of Hope. And they said, we'll try to work with you and get you in there. When we talked it over with her surgeon in Indianapolis, he said, this is very interesting. I just completed an internship at City of Hope. I know the people in administration, and he said, I think I can get you in for treatment.
Wow.
I mean, they had a long list, people waiting for treatment. But we moved to Azusa, and within the first 10 days we were there, she had an appointment at the City of Hope.
Wow.
And spent 9 months in chemotherapy, and during that 9 months continued to work with the nursing department. And after about 9 months, she went into remission. It was, they said, we don't know how long this might last, but we feel like this will be a good time. So she had one good year because, the following year, all of a sudden, she began having discomfort and went back in, and they discovered the cancer had spread.
Yeah.
Metastasized seriously throughout her whole body. So they decided that they could not do further treatment. I took her to another hospital and to try to see if we could do whatever we could do to get help for her. But after another surgery, they decided that it was just too far gone, that they were just willing to do whatever they could do to keep her comfortable and just, wait for her to pass away. I was not willing to accept that.
Yeah.
For all those years, your dad was such a great encouragement, and both Darla and Diane were constantly in contact. In fact, Darla and Darren had moved to California.
That's right.
Darren finished law school at a school in California, and Darla was working at the Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, and so they were there. We saw them at least once a week.
Yeah.
They were there to help take care of Mom and so on. But finally, in late March of 1990, she passed away. And
wow.
I think it's significant, too. For several months, your grandpa took care of Della all night and worked all day.
Wow.
And how the Lord helped him. And he said he worked with marvelous people that supported him and cared for him in the midst of that. Several months that they did that.
Wow.
God's faithfulness again.
Yep.
yeah, she got to the point about late July where she could not ingest any kind of food whatsoever. So they put her on a liquid diet that they fed her through her veins, and that's the way she was kept alive from late July till late March of the following year.
Wow.
And you do what you've got to do, and God is amazing how He helps you do things that you never thought you'd ever be able to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
But those were tough times.
Phew. Phew. I remember I don't remember how old I was when Grandma Della passed away. I don't remember a whole lot.
What year were you
her.
born?
I was born in 1985, so I guess I was 4 or 5 years old. It would have been 4 years old.
Yeah.
Not quite 5 yet. And I just remember it. For the first time in my life, I have some memories of just like heaviness and sadness, and I remember some memories of going to the funeral and not being able to understand what was going on truly, but that kind of being introduced to my world, the idea of death and sadness.
I didn't understand it either.
Yeah.
I thought, we were together for life, and Della was at a time when she had gotten her doctorate and was an excellent nurse and a great administrator, and was able to do a wonderful job of advancing the nursing department there at Azusa. And in fact, she was right at the point. That fall, she was president-elect of the state nursing, Christian Nursing Society.
Wow.
And that was one of the first things I had to do when she finally realized that she was not going to be able to continue working. I had to call the office and let them know that she was not going to be able to fulfill her responsibilities. You're tempted to ask God why.
Yeah.
I mean, she was right at the peak of her professional career.
Yeah.
And God took her, but he had a reason, and again, he had a plan, and I didn't know what it was all about.
Yeah.
But I had to bring myself to a point where I was willing to accept it.
Yeah. Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, this is years and years and years later that you would probably still say you have no idea the reason why.
No.
And yet at the same time, your heart's at peace.
Yes.
And I think that's a very important distinction, where we all have to come to the place where we go, I have no idea why.
Yep.
This doesn't make any sense to me. There's no explanation for this. And yet, at the same time, I accept it. I'm at peace with it.
And I think that's a conflict of choosing. Are you going to park there? Or are you going to? I distinctly remember the day where I said, Lord, regardless of what the past was, I will move to the future. And I didn't know I thought I knew what it looked like. I thought I knew what I would be doing.
Yeah.
But that isn't the way it worked out. But it was for me, it was a distinct afternoon.
Right.
Of choosing.
Then about a week later, I called you, didn't I?
Oh, yeah, about that.
Okay, so how did that transpire then? Well, here's an important. Let's talk about that, and then I've got a couple questions along those lines because it's the questions that we get all the time in terms of widowhood and remarriage and all that. And I'd love to hear your insight. But how did that come about? Where you guys met? And I mean, you knew each other before.
Yes.
Right. I mean, the Wesleyan world is a small world, so.
Well, and my husband was on the general board and on the college board where Jim and Della were, and we were good friends, and we even said, I remember one day Bob said, if we lived closer to them, we'd be good friends.
Wow.
But we lived several hundred miles away.
Yeah.
He pastored in Wisconsin and then Oklahoma.
Yeah, those were, it was interesting. After Della passed away, I continued to work. Actually, I'd been working for a couple of years for the Crippled Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, doing fundraising for them. And that was the job that God finally opened up for me in California. And after she passed away, I spent the next 6 months, working by day and walking the streets by night, kind of thing, until, God began to open some doors. I became I became lonely because family. I had no family. Now, Darla and Darren were there, and they were very close. But the rest of my family was back here in the Midwest, and I began to think about moving back to Indiana because I didn't feel like that was where God wanted me in ministry at that point. So things did open up, and I got a job with a small school down in southern Indiana for about a year and a half. And it was during that time, Diane said to me one day as we were visiting, she said, Dad, Mom would not have wanted you to live the rest of your life alone. We as your family feel that it's time for you to begin to open yourself up to whatever God has and whoever God has planned for you for the rest of your life.
Was that important for you, Grandpa, to hear them say that?
Yeah, it was important. It was important because 3 kids, you don't make decisions like that without considering your family.
Yeah.
And in fact, when I finally, Martha was still, Bob had passed away, and she was still working at the church there in Bartlesville. And
at the college.
And at the college, teaching at the college. And I realized that, I probably should be thinking about this. And I was sitting at the table one morning before I went to work, and my devotional time, and all of a sudden, why Martha Murphy's name came to me, I don't know, but it did, and I thought about it for several days, and finally I said, well, I know where she is, so let me call and find out what's going on. So I got on the phone and called the church, and the church secretary was someone, I knew her by name. She was a great friend of Martha's. And as I spoke with her, I said, do you happen to know how I could get in touch with Martha? And she said, I sure do. And she gave me the phone number and her address and everything, you know. I wrote it down on a small piece of paper and stuck it in my pocket and carried it around for about 2 weeks. I could not pick up enough courage. You know, dating at age 55 is different than early in life.
Yeah, this is before they had all those apps, you know, the online dating services.
That's right. They didn't have that.
So finally, one Sunday night, I was sitting there and very lonely. I said, Jim, you're a big boy. Just call Martha, and if nothing else, just to see how she's doing. So I did. I very courageously picked up the phone and gave her a call, and honestly, it just seemed like we clicked. We probably talked for an hour, and I don't know what even we talked about, except we shared a little bit of common experiences, and that was the first of several phone calls over the next month or so.
Wow. What was your take on that, Grandma?
I was totally shocked because I hadn't gotten that far in the process.
Yeah.
You know, I should say that before Bob died, he said to me, Martha, it's not a matter of if I'm going to die, it's a matter of when. And I would like you to remarry after I'm gone. And I said to him, I can't imagine it. I can't comprehend what that would be, and I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
He said, we don't have to talk about it. I just want you to know how I feel about it. So when Jim called me out of the blue and we visited, he suggested that we get together. And I told him, I said, you cannot come here. I said, it has to be some neutral place because I said to him, and I won't even meet you or talk with you unless you talk to your children. And I talked to my son, because I didn't want them to hear anything by the grapevine that they didn't already know beforehand.
Yeah.
And so we did that. And we made the decision we'd meet in St. Louis. So I flew to St. Louis and he drove, because I was in Bartlesville and Oklahoma, and so we spent a couple of days together, and we had a very nice time. He's very sharp and intelligent, and it wasn't, it was a nice visit. But when I left, I said to him, now I just really did not know what to expect from coming to meet somebody. I said, I didn't know if I'd feel like I was committing adultery, although my husband had died, but I didn't,
That's good,
and I said, I just, at this point, I don't know what I am looking about the relationship or how it would be. And I just want you to know for the very first time that I've opened myself up to visit with somebody. I can't think of anybody that would be nicer or better. He said he thought that was the biggest brush off he had ever heard. He said, when I got to know you better, I realized you were not going to say anything that you did not believe. And I should tell you, it was so scary for me because being a pastor's wife of a large church and a middle-sized church and a little church, I had experienced so many people that had second marriages that it was not a pretty picture. And it was not a good relationship. And I remember praying the night before I went to meet with Jim. And I pulled out a legal pad and said, Martha, what are the most important things to you if you were going to have a relationship with somebody else? And so I wrote a whole legal page and more questions that I felt like I would need to ask before I would even pursue
Yeah.
a friendship or a relationship.
Yeah.
And when I told my son about it, he said, "Good land, Mom." He must have felt like he was on a quiz program and really put through the third degree.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, one of the things that I've always admired about you, and it colored obviously the way that, I approached and walked through losing Amanda, and then my kind of healing journey, and then meeting Christy and remarrying. I've always appreciated from my perspective with you guys that, you guys have each talked about your late spouses with such honor and such, upholding them and with such admiration and respect. And you've been able to do it in front of each other. Right. And at the same time, it doesn't detract from how much you love each other.
Right.
And there's so many people that they don't understand. It's hard for them to fathom that concept if they've not been there. And even we talked to so many widows and widowers that struggle with, as they're getting remarried or as they're dating, like, how do I navigate that? How do I, honor the past and honor the present and future? Can I do all of that at the same time? What would you say to that?
Well, I would say that it's something you do have to deal with in your own mind and your own spirit, and realize that if you're going to develop a good relationship with your new wife, you have to accept her and her past and realize what has happened in the past is what has made her who she is today.
That's right. Yeah.
And we just, we work through that, and the Lord has helped us to. She's the best thing that's happened to me in the last 40 years. Actually, 29 years.
Yeah. 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 Isn't it amazing? You can say, Grandma Della was the best thing that happened to you then.
Right.
Yeah.
And Grandma Martha is the best thing that's happened. Right. And that's funny because I say that's how we used to say Grandma Martha, Grandma Della. Now we say Grandma because you have been our grandma, for at least
Most
all of
of
us
your
cousins,
life.
right? That's what we remember. And so I almost see it as a very providential thing in my own life that I got to witness from afar, observe you guys walking and all of that, even at a young age when I didn't have any construct for it, being able to go back and draw from that and say, what did Grandma and Grandpa do? How have they walked through this? So
I also think that at first, when we were first married, I would start to tell Jim something that I think, good land, no sense telling him that. He wasn't even there. But as we were married and we've gone through the years, we've built our own history. And we're able to talk about the experiences that we have had together and what has happened. But I was particularly conscious of, I remember telling your mom and dad and the others, Darlin, Darren, and Steve and Diane, I think it's important for you to tell your children about Della. Right. I said, I'm the only grandmother they will really actually know. But I didn't want them to feel like they couldn't share the stories of growing up about her, because it didn't take anything away from me. But it was also a part of their heritage. And I think understanding that helps you when you are knitting a blended family and you're going forward.
Right. That's so good. The last question I think I would ask you guys, and I would be remiss not to ask this question because we have so many people that they've found themselves in the middle of that valley. They've just experienced that loss, or they're in the depths of it. They feel like the water is rising up above their head. They're drowning in this sorrow. And they're beginning to believe that they're never going to be happy again, that they'll never find joy again. What would you say to that?
I think that in the midst, I remember being invited to speak a lot of places when I was first a widow. And I thought, dear Lord, I am such a mess. What do I have to share with anybody else? And I went to the interim pastor after my husband had passed away, and I said to him, Larry, I have all these places I've been invited to come and speak, but I am such a mess. What should I do about it? Should I cancel? And he looked at me and he said, Martha, you'll be healed in the going.
Wow.
And that was tremendous advice for me.
Yep.
And I also had a sister that said, when you're widowed and you're invited to do something with others, you're not going to feel like it. But she said, go ahead and do it. Because by the time you're healed enough and you want to, if you have turned down these invitations, they won't be there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, I found that to be true
Interesting.
also.
Wow.
It helped, although I can't say I was enthusiastic about a lot of those things at first.
Right.
It was a path to healing.
Wow. That is so true. And so, I hadn't thought about that. How many opportunities people invited me to go on right after Amanda passed away.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking to myself, man, if situation was different, I would be thrilled to be in this, have this opportunity. But I'm frustrated with it right now, because Amanda's gone and I want her to be with me in this. And and yet it was in receiving those opportunities and going into those that I began to, the Lord showed up for me in those places.
And you healed.
And I began to find healing.
Yeah.
He began to bring that healing to me. That's very... Yeah, I had not drawn that parallel at all, but that was really good. That's really good. Huh.
But you have to be open to his healing.
Yeah.
And I think you have to actively seek it.
Yeah.
After Della passed away, I mean, it was a lonely time, and it was very difficult to get out of bed in the morning and go work because it was just, like you said, it's almost like, I was just inundated with loneliness and grief. But in looking back, I think one of the important things is let yourself grieve. I mean, and we all grieve in different ways, but grief is not a bad thing.
Yeah, right.
It helps you to heal. It
Right.
brings healing.
Right.
And so after 3 or 4 months, I began to feel alive again and feeling like I wanted life to go on.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. Yeah. Grief is not a bad thing. And it has a stigma. People don't, because it's uncomfortable. It hurts.
Yeah,
it's a negative emotion that we don't like to experience. We don't like to feel. And yet it is the portal to our healing. It's the thing that it's a gift to us.
I also think it's important to have some good, solid friendships of people. I can remember when Jim started visiting with me, even I said I did not pray for somebody. I was not looking. I wasn't expecting. I might have been down the hill, down the road, but not at that point. And I remember a friend of mine saying, God didn't send a Jim Blackburn for me, but he did for you. And being open, I think friendships and others that love you and walk with you are important.
Right.
Input, because sometimes you can't think very clearly yourself.
Yeah, that is for sure. Wow.
And I had a very strong church that supported me at that time. I was attending Arrow Highway Wesleyan Church in Azusa. And the pastor was a great friend, and I had so many friends in the church, and they were so supportive, and it was just, it was the best kind of situation.
Yeah.
And God had prepared prepared the way.
Right, right. Well, we see throughout the threads of your stories and my story and so many people that we have conversations with on this podcast that God is carrying us through all of these things.
Yes.
That there's a hammock underneath us. There's an umbrella over top of us. He's walking with us. He's walking beside us. He's carrying us. And that seems to be the story over and over and over and over. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation with you guys, because I knew that you're going to be able to, you reach back for years and say, yes, this is true. God is faithful. You may not feel it in the moment, but when you look back, you can see his faithfulness, and it gives you the assurance that he's going to continue to be faithful no matter what you face.
That's right.
So guys, thank you so much for spending time with me and having this conversation.
It's our privilege.
It's been a pleasure.
We love you.
I love you too.
Love you much. Absolutely.